This is part 7 of the real Easter story. And as always, we have some review questions for you. So are you ready? Question number 1. When the crowd arrested Jesus, who did they take Jesus to first? Jaden?
Annas.
Annas. Number 2. Who did Annas send Jesus to? Jansen?
Caiaphas.
Caiaphas, yes. Number 3. What did Caiaphas do when Jesus said he was the Christ? Jace?
He ripped his clothes and he was being a drama llama.
Yes, he ripped his clothes and he was being a drama llama Caiaphas. All right, number 4. What did Peter do when he realized that he had denied Jesus 3 times? Jaden?
He went out and wept bitterly.
Yes, he wept bitterly. Number 5. Could the Sanhedrin put Jesus to death? Jansen?
No, only the Roman governor could.
Only the Roman governor could put people to death. That's right. Number 6. What did Judas do when he heard that the Sanhedrin had condemned Jesus to death? Jace?
He got his 30 pieces of silver, went to the high priest, and threw them on the ground.
Yes, he threw his 30 pieces of silver onto the floor. Number 7. What did the chief priests do with that money, Jaden?
They went and picked it up and said, we can't put this in the treasury. So they went and bought a potter's field.
Yes, they went and bought a potter's field to bury strangers because that was blood money. That's right. All right, very good. You guys are doing excellent on these questions, so keep it up. All right, so we have 3 more code words that I've hidden in our story. Now, these are a little tricky, so listen carefully. Praetorium, Herod, and Barabbas. Praetorium, Herod, and Barabbas. Praetorium was like the judgment hall. That's where Pilate lived. That was his palace. Herod is a ruler and Barabbas is a criminal. So be listening very carefully for those 3 words. Praetorium, Herod, and Barabbas. All right, so we left off in our story with the Sanhedrin taking Jesus to see Pontius Pilate. Now, Pontius Pilate, he was known for being cruel and mean, and he had sentenced a lot of people to death. But when they got to Pontius Pilate's house, they couldn't actually go inside. You see, the Jews had this custom that if it was Passover, they couldn't enter into the house of a Gentile, or they would be defiled or unclean. And so they couldn't actually go inside of Pilate's house. And Pilate's house was called the Praetorium. So they couldn't go inside the Praetorium. So Pilate had to come out to them. And so the angry crowd started accusing Jesus and telling Pilate that they wanted him to have the death sentence. So Pilate said, okay, I'll take the case. And he took the case, he talked to Jesus, but he couldn't find anything worth death. And so he took him back out and said that he had found no fault in him. Now, Pilate was mean and cruel, and he usually had no problem putting people to death. But even Pilate knew that this case was different. Jesus was special. So he didn't want to be responsible for this man. But the crowd still wanted death. They still cried out that they wanted Jesus to die. While they were shouting, Pilate realized that Jesus was a Galilean. And the ruler of Galilee at that time was Herod. And Herod so happened to be in Jerusalem because of the Passover. So that was convenient. So Pilate thought, ooh, I'm just going to send him to Herod. Herod can take care of him. So he sent Jesus off to Herod. Now, Herod was actually excited to see Jesus. He was glad to see Jesus because he had heard about him. He had heard about the miracles that he had done. And so when they brought Jesus in front of him, Herod started asking him many questions. He probably even asked him to do a miracle for him. But Jesus just stood there and he was silent. He said nothing. So this obviously made Herod mad and the people in the room a little bit mad. And so they just started laughing at him and mocking him. And they got a fancy robe and they put it on him and they were making fun of him. And they said, send him back to Pilate. He's just a crazy man. And so they sent him back to Pilate. And so Pilate brought him back to the people, brought him in front of the people again. And he said, I have examined him. Herod has examined him. And we find no fault with this man. But the people kept crying out, "Kill Jesus!" They wanted to kill Jesus. They were not satisfied. So Pilate really did not want to put this man to death. And so he had another idea. The Romans had a custom where every year they would release one prisoner for the Passover. So Pilate thought, "Ooh, I'm going to pick the worst prisoner, the worst guy, the meanest guy." This guy was a robber and he was a murderer. And his name was Barabbas. And so he brought forth Barabbas and he put him in front of the people and he said, "Who do you choose? Who do you want me to release? Jesus or Barabbas?" And Pilate sat down, probably to let them think over their choice. But something interesting happened while he was sitting there. A message came from his wife. And the message was very urgent. It was almost like a warning. It said, "Have nothing to do with this just man." She called him a just man. It said, "Have nothing to do with this just man. I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him. Have nothing to do with him." Well, the chief priests and the scribes were outside and they were talking to the people, convincing them, "Say we want Barabbas. Say that we want Barabbas to be released." So when Pilate stood up, they said, "Barabbas, we want Barabbas. Give us Barabbas." And Pilate was kind of surprised at this. He thought that they would choose Jesus. And so he said, "Well, then what should I do with Jesus?" And they said, "Crucify him." So now, not only do they want Jesus dead, they want to crucify him, torture him. And Pilate said, "Why? What has he done?" But they just kept yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him." And it was getting out of control. And Pilate started getting nervous because he was the one who was supposed to keep the peace. And they were getting out of control. And so Pilate sent him back into the Praetorium. And he sent him to be scourged. Scourged means to be whipped. And so the soldiers took him back into the Praetorium. And they began beating him and whipping him and lashing him. And they tortured him so badly that he could barely stand. And they made this crown of really sharp thorns. And they took it and they put it on his head. They pushed it into his head. And the thorns went into his head. And then they took a reed, which is just a rod, and they gave it to him. "Here, hold this," like it was a scepter. They were making fun of him like he was holding the scepter of a king. And then they put a purple robe on his shoulder like a king would. And they began bowing down to him, mocking him, saying, "Oh, hail, King of the Jews." And they took the reed out of his hand and they began beating him on the head with it. And they tortured him so badly. And so they took him back to Pilate. Pilate took Jesus before the crowd again. And he said, "Behold the man." Which Pilate was probably pretty proud of himself because he didn't even look like a man at that point. He looked terrible. Pilate thought that when the crowd saw him and how badly he looked, that they would be satisfied with that. But they weren't satisfied. When they saw Jesus, they cried out even more, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate, he was afraid of the people. And so he took some water and he began washing his hands in the water. And he said, "I am innocent of the blood of this just man. Take him, do what you will." You see, he thought that washing his hands would give him a clean slate, but it didn't. He was just as guilty. He was worried more about his position than doing what was right. He had several opportunities to make it right. He knew Jesus was innocent, but he gave in to the pressure of the crowd. And so the soldiers took Jesus and they led him away to be crucified. And we're going to talk about the crucifixion in our next lesson. All right, so did you find our 3 code words? Praetorium, Herod, and Barabbas?
Yes.
I hope you did. Okay, and we will see you in our next lesson. Bye!